America.
How is it that one of America's smallest states cultivates popular movements that sometimes spread across the nation? And it's nothing new.
There is a kind of a pattern of contrarian spirit.
The author of a new Vermont history book will join us on our Sunday program. Good morning. I'm Sarah Beth Ackerman, and this is NBC5 In Depth. Greg Guma, whose new book describes Vermont's quirky politics and popular movements. Don't go away. Vermont, long one of the nation's most reliable Republican states, morphed into the home of Ben and Jerry, of Bernie Sanders. Well, it happened gradually, and Burlington author Greg Guma has been around for most of it.
Joining us this morning, Greg Guma, author, newspaper editor, reporter, bookshop proprietor, even ran for mayor of Burlington at one point. Thank you very much for being with us on NBC5 In Depth.
It's a pleasure.
Your latest book is Restless Spirits and Popular Movements of Vermont History, and that's why we wanted to have you on this morning. It's
great.
It's an interesting, it's a very interesting read if you like Vermont history and Burlington politics in particular. By the way, what is on the cover?
That's a photograph that I took over 50 years ago in front of the Bennington Monument during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. And a lot of editors have liked it, and it's part of a photo essay that also appears in the book.
So you moved from New York City to Bennington in 1968 and never left Vermont.
Well, only for work.
Culture shock.
Only for work when I had to. But yes, I was in Bennington for 5 years, and then in the Champlain Valley, and then in Burlington starting in '76, and this has been my base ever since.
You've done a lot of things in your 75 years. You said earlier in another interview that this book took you 45 years to write.
That's true in a sense that it began in 1976 with a project called Vermont's Untold History, which came out of a bookstore that I was involved with. And that was sort of a response to the bicentennial. And I began then writing history and exploring stories told and untold, and then collecting anecdotes and interviews. And, for the next 40 years, and about 5 years ago, getting frustrated, I published a limited digital edition, but I've been waiting to do this for a long time.
So what gave you the idea, though, to write about Vermont's sort of quirky politics and popular movements?
Well, I mean, covering them as a journalist, I often covered some of these events, and there are interviews and stories in there that are based on things that I saw and experienced. And also, as a sort of student of history, I'm interested in exploring the broader context and the values that underpin the things that happen. I think that history tells a story, and that different places have different threads that run through them. So I'm not only telling stories, I'm exploring what I think are some of the enduring and evolving values of Vermont.
And this goes way beyond, we think in the modern era of course, Bernie Sanders, and he's a transformative figure who, as you know, I mean, there's a lot of history from the 60s and 70s in this book. And as we know, he started running for public office in Vermont, on a shoestring with a VW Beetle, and he got, 1 or 2% of the vote running for the U.S. Senate. And now look at him.
And I met him back then. I met him very, very early on in his career, late 1971, during his very first race for the U.S. Senate after Winston Prouty died. And so that transition period. And we had a fight the first time we met.
So are you on speaking terms today?
Well, I haven't seen him. He's pretty inaccessible these days. I haven't interviewed him for about 10 years. When I was still reporting for VT Digger, I did see him on occasion, but I wouldn't say we were ever friends. We were allies. We had a lot of contact in the 70s and especially in the 80s when he was mayor.
Well, what do you think allowed Bernie Sanders to to happen in Vermont?
Well, I think that the conditions were developing in Burlington specifically, and Bernie, this wasn't his first choice to run for mayor. He had to be convinced to run for mayor by some friends of his who said, you know, you can run for governor or Senate forever and you probably won't get there, but if you run for a local office, you have a better chance. And so the conditions were developing in Burlington, a Democratic administration that had been in power for a long time, Paquette for 10 years, but the Democrats before that for a period of time. They were not that tolerant or open to newcomers. There was a lot of disenfranchised populations. I played a role too because I was the editor of the alternative newspaper, the Vanguard Press, during that pre-Bernie period. And so we started to discuss the issues that the quote-unquote establishment didn't want to look at. So, you know, you got to a point where there was an insurgency possible and a Democratic Party that didn't want to talk about the issues and a Republican Party that had basically laid down. And so it created a vacuum and an opening for an opposition voice. Journalists played a role. Mickey Gallagher, famously from WCAX, decided to give Bernie Sanders a shot because he was tired of listening to Gordon Paquette. So a lot of these conditions, and then demographics, of course. Vermont's demographics were changing. There had been in-migrations of ex-urban professionals and counterculturalists. And so you reached a kind of a critical mass where someone could get 40%, which is what he got the first time. And then once he was in office, he demonstrated that, well, he could run the city and he could find a new generation of people and they could, you know, get things done. And so he demonstrated competence, and that's what kept him in power, plus his oratorical abilities. I mean, he's a great politician, just generally, who needed an opening, and he found it as an independent.
But he wasn't the first progressive mayor of Burlington, even though, you know, he's always run as an independent. You have some very interesting history about James Burke back at the turn of the century, 1903, which I didn't know, and some of his, you know, progressive ideas that he brought forth.
Well, I love James Burke. He was an Irish Catholic blacksmith who entered politics initially in his 40s on the city council and then became mayor in 1903. And progressivism was different then, but he was fighting corporate interests. That's similar to Burlington, the railroads, the emerging electric companies. He was for, you know, a form of enfranchisement for the new immigrants, Italians, Irish, German, all the different people down on the waterfront, and again, demonstrated competence and a fiery ability to mobilize people. And he was in and out of office on one-year terms. They had one-year terms for mayor back then. So he would be in for a couple of years, and then he'd be out, and then he'd be in again and out again. And these fights he was fighting continued throughout that period of time to get a wharf on the waterfront so that there, you know, that there could be more development down there, to you know, public bathrooms, public power in general, the municipal electric company. All these things date from the Burke era.
It's kind of remarkable that a state the size of Vermont has produced two presidential candidates in the last couple of decades. Is that consistent with sort of that restless spirit that you describe the narrative throughout the book?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think that both these people, Howard Dean to some extent and Bernie Sanders even to a greater extent, both reflect some of these enduring values. Now, there have been other people who have expressed them as well. George Aiken and the Aiken-Gibson wing. I go back as far as Matthew Lyon, who fought John Adams and went to jail and was reelected to Congress while he was in jail in Vergennes. A remarkable story. And the first third party, the anti-Masons, who didn't succeed nationally, but in Vermont, there was an anti-Mason governor for several years. And so these things, including leading in the anti-slavery movement, so there is a kind of a pattern of contrarian spirit. I sometimes call it maverick, and I used it as a DBA for some of my business enterprises. So this spirit of breaking from the mold and challenging authority, I think the state really challenged New York right at the beginning and saying, you don't own us, during the Revolutionary War. And so this goes back. It's if states have DNA, it's in there somewhere.
Well, it's an interesting read. Restless Spirits and Popular Movements, A Vermont History by Greg Guma. It's been our pleasure having you on.
Pleasure for me, too. Great to talk to you.
And the book is available at local bookstores and online at vermontresearchbooks.org. We'll be right back.